A Hell's Angel turned millionaire whispers to the Black Maid, "I'd give up my empire for your touch." But what could make a man with everything, money, power, fame, fall to his knees for a woman who cleans his floors? He's a former outlaw running from a past soaked in guilt. She's a widow who still prays for the man who killed her husband, without knowing it's him. When fate forces them to work side by side in a small-town church kitchen, something unexpected happens. His hardened heart begins to thaw, and her faith begins to heal him. But the truth he's hiding could destroy them both. When she discovers who he really is, forgiveness might be harder than love itself. He built an empire to forget his sins, and now he's ready to burn it all down for a single touch of grace. Will she forgive the man who stole everything from her heart? Or will his confession shatter the only woman who ever saw the good in him? "I'd give up my empire for your touch," Hell's Angel whispered to the Black Maid, a story of guilt, grace, and the power of a single act of forgiveness. Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pinewood County Courthouse steps as Reed "Razor" Callahan stood with his shoulders squared, jaw clenched. The small Georgia town's justice system had just handed down its verdict, and for a man who owned half the trucks running through the Southeast, it felt like a slap in the face. 120 hours of community service at St. Mary's Soup Kitchen, Judge Harrison had declared, peering over his reading glasses with a mix of sternness and what looked almost like satisfaction. "Perhaps some time serving others will help cool that temper of yours, Mr. Callahan." Reed's expensive Italian leather shoes clicked against the courthouse's marble floors as he strode out, ignoring the whispers that followed him. At 52 years old, he still cut an imposing figure, 6 feet 2 inches of solid muscle, graying hair cropped short, and eyes that could freeze hell itself. The designer suit couldn't quite hide the man who'd once worn leather cuts with the Hell's Angels patch. The bar fight had been stupid, he knew that. Some drunk kid had mouthed off about his past, called him a reformed thug playing businessman. 20 years ago, he would have put the kid in the hospital. Last night, he'd only knocked him down. Progress, he supposed, though the judge hadn't seen it that way. His Ferrari roared to life, the engine's growl echoing off the old buildings of downtown Pinewood. The town hadn't changed much in the 30 years since he'd first rolled through on a Harley. Same storefronts, same gossiping old-timers on the benches outside the hardware store, same judgmental stares. Only difference was now they whispered about the man who owned Callahan Trucking instead of the outlaw biker. The mansion appeared through the trees as he turned onto his private drive. 10,000 square feet of architectural perfection sitting on 50 acres. It was everything he'd dreamed of back when he was riding with the club. Proof that he'd made it. The garage door opened silently, and he pulled in beside the row of other expensive cars that meant nothing to him anymore. Inside, his footsteps echoed through empty halls. Original artwork hung on walls that had never heard children's laughter. Crystal chandeliers sparkled over rooms where no one ever sat. The cleaning service kept everything pristine, sterile, perfect, and completely lifeless. Reed loosened his tie as he walked into his study. The bar cart caught his eye, and he poured 3 fingers of bourbon into a crystal tumbler. The liquid burned going down, but it was an old friend by now. He dropped heavily into the leather chair behind his desk, the weight of the day, of all his days, pressing down on his shoulders. The bottom drawer opened with a familiar scrape. Inside lay a small silver cross on a delicate chain, tarnished with age and memories. He didn't need to pick it up anymore. Every detail was burned into his mind. The way it had glinted in his headlight beam that rainy night. How it had somehow ended up in his hand as he stood there. The wreck of his bike. and the other car smoking in the darkness. The screams! God, the screams! He took another long drink, trying to drown out the sounds that still haunted him 25 years later. The police had ruled it an accident. Slick roads, bad visibility. But he knew the truth. He'd been showing off, taking curves too fast when the other car appeared. The woman's face in the brief flash of his headlight. The sickening crunch of metal. He'd walked away with scrapes and bruises. She hadn't walked away at all. Reed set the glass down harder than necessary, the crystal clinking against the wooden desk. The court order lay there, the official letterhead seeming to mock him. 120 hours at St. Mary's Soup Kitchen. 120 hours of serving food to the down and out, the very people he'd once been before he'd built his empire. The bourbon wasn't doing its job tonight. The memories kept coming, sharper than ever. The silver cross caught the lamplight as he finally picked it up, letting the chain run through his fingers. He'd tried to get rid of it countless times over the years. Had driven to the river, stood on bridges, held it over trash cans. But he could never let it go. It was his penance, his reminder, the physical manifestation of his guilt. He dropped the cross back in the drawer and pulled the court order closer, reading it again. Report to St. Mary's at 9 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning. Proper attire required. No exceptions, no delays. The house creaked and settled around him, the silence as heavy as a wool blanket in August. Through the study windows, he could see his reflection overlaid on the darkening sky. Successful businessman, reformed outlaw, pillar of the community. All the things he'd built himself into, trying to outrun that rainy night and the silver cross that wouldn't let him forget. Reed picked up the glass again, swirling the remaining bourbon. Tomorrow he'd walk into that soup kitchen, do his time, and add it to the long list of things he'd endured. He'd survived prison, survived leaving the club, survived building a legitimate empire from nothing. He could survive this too. But as the night deepened around him and the bourbon slowly disappeared, that silver cross seemed to weigh more heavily in its drawer than all his wealth and success combined. 120 hours of facing the kind of people he'd once been, before the money and the power had given him a mask to hide behind. 120 hours of wondering if any amount of good deeds could make up for one terrible night. The crystal tumbler was empty now, but he didn't move to refill it. Instead, he sat in his expensive chair, in his expensive house, surrounded by all the things he'd bought to prove he'd changed, and felt every bit as lost as he had that night in the rain, holding a stranger's silver cross in trembling hands. The morning sun crept through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across Lorraine Field's small but immaculate kitchen. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the sweet, homey scent of cornbread just pulled from the oven. At 4:30 in the morning, while most of Pinewood still slept, Lorraine moved with practiced grace through her morning routine. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," she hummed softly, pressing her iron across the crisp white apron she wore for kitchen duty at St. Mary's. The steam rose in gentle clouds, and she smoothed each wrinkle with the same care she gave everything in her life. 23 years of cleaning motel rooms had taught her the value of attention to detail. Her kitchen, though modest, sparkled with decades of loving care. Family photos lined the mint green walls, most featuring a tall, broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and an easy smile. Henry. Even after 8 years, seeing his face still made her heart catch. She touched the gold band she still wore, remembering how he'd slip up behind her on mornings like this, wrap his strong arms around her waist, and harmonize with whatever hymn she was singing. "This is the day the Lord has made," Lorraine reminded herself, pushing back the familiar ache. She'd chosen early on not to let bitterness take root after the accident, It hadn't been easy, especially in those first dark months after the police said they couldn't identify the biker who'd run Henry's car off the road. But Faith had carried her through, one day at a time. She packed the cornbread carefully into a covered dish, adding it to her bag along with her freshly pressed apron. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky pink when she locked her front door and started the 10-minute walk to the Pine Grove Motel. Margaret, the night clerk, greeted her with a sleepy wave as Lorraine collected her cleaning cart. "Rooms 203 through 215 today, sugar," Margaret called out. "And 211's a mess. Bunch of salesmen had some kind of party." Lorraine nodded, already mentally organizing her approach. "Lord gives us strength for whatever comes our way," she said with a smile. The work was hard on her knees some days, but she'd learned to pace herself. By 8:30, she'd transformed even room 211 from chaos back to order. After changing into fresh clothes in the staff room, she hurried the 6 blocks to St. Mary's. The old brick church stood solid and reassuring against the morning sky, its stained glass windows catching the sunlight. Inside the parish kitchen, the familiar scents of coffee and industrial cleaner greeted her. "Morning, Miss Lorraine." Pastor Donnelly's warm voice boomed across the kitchen. He was a tall man with silver hair and laugh lines around his eyes, though today she noticed a slight tension in his shoulders. "Got something to tell you about today's crew." She tied on her crisp apron, noting how he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Everything all right, Pastor?" "Well," he scratched his chin thoughtfully. "We're getting a new volunteer. Man's a bit rough around the edges. Court-ordered community service." Lorraine's hands stilled on her apron strings. They'd had court-ordered help before, but something in the pastor's tone made her pause. Before she could ask more questions, the kitchen's heavy door swung open. The man who walked in seemed to fill the doorway. Tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and hard eyes, he carried himself like someone used to taking up space. His expensive clothes couldn't quite hide an edge of danger that clung to him like smoke. Something primitive in Lorraine's mind whispered, "Predator," but she pressed her lips into a warm smile. "Welcome to St. Mary's Kitchen," she said evenly. "I'm Lorraine Fields." He barely met her eyes, muttering something that might have been "Reed Callahan" as he shrugged out of his leather jacket. His movements were defensive, like he was expecting an attack from any direction. Pastor Donnelly cleared his throat. "Reed here will be with us for a while. Lorraine, would you mind showing him the ropes?" The morning stretched long and awkward. Reed struggled with the industrial can opener, cursed under his breath at the ancient dishwasher, and managed to splatter tomato sauce across his designer shirt. Lorraine noticed how the other volunteers gave him a wide berth, but she kept her voice gentle and her instructions clear. By lunch rush, something interesting began to happen. The usual chaos of serving, the clatter of trays, the buzz of conversations, the occasional raised voice, seemed to smooth out around Lorraine. She moved through the crowded serving line with calm purpose, and Reed found himself watching how she handled even the most difficult customers with unshakable grace. When an elderly man with trembling hands spilled his soup, Reed tensed for a scene. But Lorraine was already there with a mop and a kind word, helping the man to a clean table with a fresh bowl. The potential crisis dissolved into thanks and blessed murmurs. As they cleaned up after the last guest left, Reed noticed how the kitchen seemed quieter, calmer when she was near. She hummed softly while wiping down counters, and even the harsh fluorescent lights seemed softer. "That's us done for today," she announced, untying her apron. She picked up a wrapped package from her personal shelf. "Here's some cornbread for you, Mr. Callahan. Might as well have something good come from your first day here." Reed stared at the offered package like it might bite him. Then, slowly, as if remembering long unused muscles, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. Not quite a smile, but closer than he'd come all day. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Callahan," Lorraine said softly, her voice carrying the same gentle strength it had held all day. He took the cornbread with careful hands, and that almost smile flickered again across his face before he turned and walked out into the afternoon sun. The morning after Reed's first day at St. Mary's Kitchen dawned crisp and clear. He arrived 10 minutes early, surprising even himself. The old church stood quiet in the morning light, its weathered bricks holding decades of prayers and confessions. Inside the kitchen, he found Lorraine already at work, her hand steady as she measured coffee into the industrial brewer. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan," she said, not turning around. Something in her voice told him she'd known it was him just by his footsteps. "Morning," he muttered, shrugging off his jacket. "That dishwasher's still making that noise." "Has been for months now," she replied, finally turning to face him. "Pastor says we don't have the budget for repairs." Reed walked over to the offending machine, running his hand along its dented surface. "Got my tools in the truck. Might take a look later." A small smile touched Lorraine's lips. "That would be kind of you." The days began to fall into a rhythm. Reed found himself arriving earlier each morning, drawn by the peace that seemed to emanate from the kitchen when Lorraine was there. His sarcastic comments grew less biting, more like the playful banter of colleagues than the defensive barbs of a wounded man. On Wednesday, he spent 3 hours fixing the dishwasher, his sleeves rolled up and his expensive watch carefully set aside. Lorraine brought him water and watched as his capable hands restored the machine to proper working order. "Been fixing things since I was a kid," he explained, surprising himself with the voluntary information. "Started with bikes, moved up to bigger machines." "The Lord gives us all gifts," Lorraine responded. "It's what we choose to do with them that matters." Thursday found him repairing broken shelves in the pantry, the sound of his hammer mingling with Lorraine's quiet humming. The leaky faucet that had been driving everyone crazy for weeks surrendered to his expertise by Friday afternoon. As the days passed, Lorraine began to notice changes in Reed. The hard edge in his eyes softened when he thought no one was looking. He started staying after hours, helping with cleanup rather than rushing off to his empty mansion. Sometimes, she caught him watching the homeless families they served, with something that looked like remorse. It was during one such cleanup session that everything changed. Lorraine was gathering her things, her worn tote bag balanced precariously on the edge of the counter. As she reached for her coat, the bag tipped, spilling its contents across the floor. Reed moved to help, kneeling to gather scattered items. His hand froze over a small photo that had slid beneath the prep table. The image showed a smiling black man in his Sunday best, his arm around a younger Lorraine. But it was what hung around the man's neck that made Reed's blood run cold. A silver cross, identical to the one he'd kept hidden in his desk drawer for all these years. "That's Henry," Lorraine said softly, reaching for the photo. "My late husband." Reed's hands shook as he handed it back to her. His voice came out rough. How did he die?" Something flickered across Lorraine's face, pain, old and deep. "Hit and run, 7 years ago. Driver was never found." She tucked the photo carefully back into her bag. "But the Lord gives us strength to bear what we must." Reed couldn't speak. He mumbled an excuse and left quickly, his boots echoing on the church steps as he fled to his truck. That night, in his study, Reed's trembling fingers pulled open the desk drawer. The silver cross lay there, exactly as it had for 7 years, its surface still bearing tiny scratches from the pavement where he'd found it. Under the warm lamplight, He held it up, comparing it to his memory of the photo. "It's her," he whispered into the silence of his empty house. "Dear God, it's her." Sleep wouldn't come. He paced his vast home until dawn, memories crashing over him like waves, the roar of motorcycles, the flash of headlights, the sickening thud, the glint of silver in his headlight beam as he sped away. The cross he couldn't leave behind, though he'd left its owner broken on the asphalt. Morning found him at the church before anyone else, even Lorraine. When she arrived, he straightened from where he'd been leaning against his truck. "Let me drive you home today," he said, the words coming out more abruptly than he'd intended. Lorraine studied him for a long moment, her eyes gentle but knowing. "That's kind of you, Mr. Callahan, but I enjoy my walk. Gives me time to think and pray." He watched as she made her way up the street, her sensible shoes carrying her with quiet dignity. When she reached her small house, she climbed the worn steps without looking back. Reed remained in his truck, gripping the steering wheel, torn between the crushing weight of his guilt and the strange, undeserved peace her presence brought to his troubled soul. The silver cross felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket, its weight a testimony to 7 years of secrets and shame. As Lorraine disappeared into her house, Reed realized that the peace he'd begun to find in her kitchen had been built on a foundation of lies, lies that would soon crumble beneath the weight of truth. The following week brought changes to the church that few noticed, but Lorraine couldn't miss. First, it was the dining hall's ancient heating system that mysteriously sprang to life after years of sputtering. Then the cracked windows in the fellowship area were replaced with sturdy new panes that kept the draft out. Even the tired old refrigerator in the kitchen was swapped for a gleaming commercial model overnight. Pastor Donnelly seemed pleasantly puzzled by these improvements, attributing them to anonymous donations. But Lorraine noticed how Reed's eyes would drift to each new addition, a quiet satisfaction in his expression when he thought no one was watching. One Wednesday evening, dark clouds rolled in just as they were finishing up dinner service. The wind howled through the trees, and rain pounded against the windows with increasing fury. Reed had stayed late again, organizing the pantry while Lorraine cleaned the kitchen. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the building into darkness. "Stay put," Reed called out, his voice steady in the darkness. "I've got a lantern in my truck." Minutes later, soft golden light filled the kitchen as Reed set up a battery-powered lantern on the counter. Thunder crashed outside, making the windows rattle. "Looks like we might be here a while," Lorraine said, settling onto one of the kitchen stools. "Pastor Donnelly already headed home, so it's just us until this passes." Reed nodded, taking a seat across from her. The lantern cast shadows across his weathered face, softening the hard lines around his mouth. In this gentle light, he looked younger, more vulnerable. "You've been fixing things," Lorraine said quietly. It wasn't a question. Reed shifted uncomfortably. "Place needed work. I know people who know people." "That's kind of you." "Kind isn't a word most would use for me," he replied, his voice rough. Lightning flashed, illuminating the kitchen in stark white for a moment. In the following thunder, Lorraine waited patiently, sensing Reed had more to say. "Had a brother once," he finally continued, staring at his hands. "Tommy. Younger than me by 6 years. Smart kid, could have been something." He swallowed hard. Found him with a needle in his arm when he was 22. Lorraine's breath caught. "I'm so sorry, Reed. After that, I just lost it. Joined the Angels, found family in violence and chaos. Didn't care if I lived or died." His voice dropped lower. "Did terrible things. Built an empire on blood and broken promises. Another crack of thunder, closer now. The lantern light flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "But you changed," Lorraine observed softly. Reed laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Changed? Maybe. Still alone, though? Big house, fleet of trucks, more money than I can spend, and not a soul to share it with. Guess that's justice." "Loneliness isn't justice, Reed. It's a prison we build ourselves." His eyes met hers, intense and searching. "How do you do it? Stay so kind after everything life's thrown at you?" "Faith," she answered simply. "Not just in God, but in the possibility of good in everyone, even those who've lost their way." Reed's hands clenched on the counter, knuckles scarred from countless fights. Without hesitation, Lorraine reached out, placing her hand over his. His skin was rough beneath her touch, but she felt him trembling. "I'd give up my empire for your touch," he whispered, his voice breaking. The words seemed to surprise him as much as her. At that moment, the lights buzzed back to life, flooding the kitchen with harsh fluorescent brightness. They both blinked, tears glistening in their eyes. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. Later that night, kneeling beside her bed, Lorraine clasped her hands in prayer. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for softening his heart. Help him find the peace he seeks." Miles away, Reed sat in his truck outside Lorraine's modest home, watching the light in her window. The silver cross weighed heavy in his pocket, a constant reminder of the truth that threatened to destroy everything. The peace he'd found in her presence felt like a cruel joke now, a temporary respite he didn't deserve. The storm had passed, but Reed knew darker clouds were gathering. As he started his truck and pulled away from the curb, he couldn't shake the feeling that his time in the light was running out. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Reed's sprawling mansion as Lorraine adjusted her cleaning apron. It had been a week since he'd offered her the part-time position, insisting she was wasting her talents cleaning motel rooms. The pay was better, the hours more flexible, and something about his earnest plea had made it impossible to refuse. "Just the study today, if you don't mind," Reed had said that morning, keys jangling as he headed out for a meeting. "Been meaning to get it organized for ages." Now, alone in his study, Lorraine methodically worked through the space. The room spoke of wealth but felt unlived in. Expensive leather furniture barely touched, pristine bookshelves too neat to be regularly used. Only the massive oak desk showed signs of life, covered in papers and files. She hummed softly while dusting, the same gospel tune she'd been singing when Reed first walked into the church kitchen. How different things felt now. The gruff, defensive man had slowly revealed layers of kindness, even vulnerability. Each day brought new discoveries about him, like how he always made sure the older volunteers had rides home, or how he'd slip extra money into the donation box when he thought no one was looking. Thunder rumbled in the distance as she organized the desk, careful not to disturb anything important. Her hand brushed against a drawer that wasn't quite closed. As she pushed it shut, something caught. A manila folder wedged at an odd angle. "Oh dear," she muttered, trying to straighten it. The folder slipped, spilling its contents across the floor. Lorraine knelt to gather the scattered papers. Her fingers froze mid-reach as her eyes fell on a photograph. A mangled motorcycle on a rain-slicked road, its chrome twisted beyond recognition. Next to it lay a police report, and pinned to the corner was a silver cross that made her heart stop. She knew that cross, had chosen it herself as an anniversary gift for Henry, had watched him wear it proudly every Sunday at church. The cross that had gone missing the night he died. Her hands trembling, Lorraine picked up the police report. The words swam before her eyes until they locked onto a name. Henry Fields. The room seemed to tilt sideways. She gripped the edge of the desk, bile rising in her throat as more details emerged from the scattered papers. Witness statements, medical reports, insurance claims, all of it pointing to one horrible truth. Time became fluid. She didn't know how long she sat there, surrounded by the evidence of her world shattering. The sound of the front door opening barely registered. "Lorraine?" Reed's voice carried down the hallway. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was—" He appeared in the doorway, stopping mid-sentence as he took in the scene. All color drained from his face. "You," Lorraine whispered, her voice raw. "It was you." Reed stood frozen, his massive frame filling the doorway. Outside, the threatening storm finally broke, rain beginning to hammer against the windows. "Lorraine, Don't." She stood, papers clutched in her shaking hands. "All this time, all these weeks, you knew who I was, didn't you? Knew what you'd done to Henry?" "Yes." The word seemed to cost him physically. "Why?" The question tore from her throat. "Why didn't you tell me?" Reed took a step forward, stopping when she flinched back. "I wanted to. Every day, every moment we spent together, I wanted to tell you. But I was a coward, afraid of losing." "Losing what?" Lightning flashed, illuminating the tears on her cheeks. "The chance to ease your guilt, to make yourself feel better about killing my husband?" "No." The word exploded from him. "It wasn't like that. Please, let me explain." "Explain what? How you left him there to die?" "I didn't," Reed's voice cracked. "I swear to God, Lorraine, I didn't run. The others did, my gang. But I stayed. I called for help. I tried to." His hands clenched into fists. "I tried to save him." Lorraine stared at him, memories of that night flooding back. The police had mentioned an anonymous call, a witness who'd vanished before they arrived. "You were there," she whispered. "You watched them lower him into the ground, didn't you? I remember seeing a man at the funeral standing far back under the trees." Reed's silence was answer enough. "How dare you?" she breathed. "How dare you come into my life, accept my kindness, knowing what you'd done? I trusted you. Her voice broke. "I was starting to care for you." She crossed the space between them in 3 quick steps. The crack of her palm against his cheek echoed like another thunderclap. Reed didn't move, didn't try to block the blow. "Lorraine!" But she was already pushing past him, running through the house. The rain drenched her instantly as she burst outside, but she didn't slow down. Behind her, she heard Reed calling her name, his voice lost in the storm. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing onto a bus stop bench 2 blocks away. The rain mixed with her tears as everything she'd believed about the past few weeks crumbled around her. Reed stood in his doorway, soaked to the skin, watching her disappear into the darkness. He stayed there long after she'd gone, the rain washing over him like the judgment he'd always known would come. When dawn broke, pale and uncertain through lingering clouds, a single envelope lay on his doorstep. Inside, written in Lorraine's careful hand, were 5 words that cut deeper than any knife. Some truths take a lifetime to forgive. The calendar pages turned without mercy. Each morning, Reed checked his phone, hoping to see Lorraine's name. Each morning, the screen remained dark with her silence. Summer heat gave way to autumn's chill, painting Pinewood's streets with fallen leaves that skittered past Reed's office window like memories he couldn't catch. He sat at his desk, staring at paperwork he couldn't focus on, when Marcus, his chief financial officer, knocked on the door. "Sir, we have a situation." Marcus's usually confident voice wavered. "It's about the Atlanta contracts." Reed looked up, noting the sheen of sweat on his CFO's forehead. "What about them?" Channel 8 News is running a story tonight. They have evidence that Jim Peterson, our regional manager, has been bribing city officials to secure contracts. Marcus placed a thick folder on Reed's desk. They have recordings, bank transfers. It's bad, sir. The words hit Reed like physical blows. Jim Peterson had been with the company for 15 years. Reed had trusted him, promoted him, invited him to Christmas dinners. How many contracts? Reed's voice was hoarse. 7 major ones, worth about $48 million total. Reed closed his eyes. In his mind, he could hear Lorraine's voice from weeks ago, talking about integrity while they worked side by side in the church kitchen. The memory twisted like a knife in his gut. Within days, the scandal exploded. News vans camped outside Callahan Trucking's headquarters. Clients called hourly to cancel contracts. The stock price plummeted. Reed's phone rang constantly, but never with the one call he actually wanted. He stopped going to the office. The mansion's silence wrapped around him like a shroud as he wandered its empty halls. Dust gathered on the expensive furniture. Takeout containers piled up in the kitchen. His beard grew wild, and dark circles deepened under his eyes. Across town, in her small house, Lorraine wasn't faring much better. The stress of recent weeks had taken its toll. She worked her cleaning jobs mechanically, moving through life like a ghost. The betrayal had reopened old wounds, and something else was wrong. A deep, rattling cough that wouldn't go away. One morning, she woke to find blood on her tissue. She stared at the bright red spots, fear creeping through her veins. But when Pastor Donnelly asked how she was doing after Sunday service, she forced a smile. "Just fine, Pastor. The Lord provides." The pastor's kind eyes saw through her facade, but he didn't push. "You know my door's always open, Lorraine." She nodded, clutching her Bible closer to her chest, hiding another cough. Reed, meanwhile, found himself driving past the church late at night. One evening, unable to bear his empty house anymore, he parked his truck and walked the grounds. The building needed work, peeling paint, loose shingles, a dripping gutter. Before he knew what he was doing, he was returning with tools from his garage. Night after night, he worked in darkness. He fixed the leaking roof, replaced rotted wood, and repainted walls. The physical labor felt like penance, each hammer stroke a prayer for redemption. He made sure to finish before dawn, leaving no trace of his presence. But one night, as he was touching up paint in the fellowship hall, a light clicked on. "I wondered when you'd show yourself," Pastor Donnelly said quietly. Reed nearly dropped his paintbrush. He looked like a shadow of his former self, thinner, grayer, his expensive clothes replaced by worn work clothes stained with paint. "Pastor, Reed's voice cracked. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "Sit down, son." The pastor pulled up 2 folding chairs. "I think it's time we talked." Reed sank into the chair, suddenly exhausted. The story poured out of him. The night of Henry's death, the years of guilt, meeting Lorraine, falling in love with her kindness, the devastating revelation. His words tumbled out between sobs that shook his large frame. "I've lost everything," he whispered. "My company's falling apart. But none of that matters compared to losing her. I need her to forgive me." Pastor Donnelly was quiet for a long moment, studying the broken man before him. Outside, a train whistle echoed mournfully through the night. "Redemption doesn't start with forgiveness," the pastor finally said, his voice gentle but firm. "It starts with confession." Reed looked up, tears cutting tracks through the paint dust on his face. "You've been trying to earn your way back to grace," the pastor continued, "but real redemption isn't about what you do. It's about who you become. You've confessed to me, but have you truly confessed to God? Have you accepted that you can't fix this on your own? Reed's shoulders slumped. All his wealth, all his power, all his desperate attempts to make things right, none of it had filled the void in his soul. I don't know how, he admitted. Then that's where we start, Pastor Donnelly said, placing a weathered hand on Reed's shoulder. Right here, right now, with that honest truth. The two men sat in the quiet church, surrounded by the smell of fresh paint and ancient hymn books, as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the stained glass windows. Outside, fallen leaves skittered across the empty parking lot, and somewhere in her small house, Lorraine coughed in her sleep. Both of them carried by currents they couldn't control, moving toward a future neither could see. Reed sat in his office, staring at the framed photo of his first truck, a beat-up Peterbilt he'd bought when starting his company. Now he had a fleet of over 100 vehicles, but that first one held special meaning. His fingers traced the chrome bumper in the image as memories washed over him. The decision wasn't hard. He picked up his phone. Jake. Yeah, it's Reed. Remember that collector who wanted my original Peterbilt? Tell him it's his. Full asking price. He hung up before his operations manager could question the sudden change of heart. The truck had been sitting in a climate-controlled warehouse, preserved like a museum piece. Reed had always said he'd never sell it. But now, looking at the church's mortgage papers spread across his desk, he knew exactly where that money needed to go. The next morning, he walked into Pinewood First National Bank, wearing a plain work shirt instead of his usual tailored suits. The teller's eyes widened when he presented the cashier's check. This is to pay off the mortgage for Pinewood Community Church, he said quietly. In full. The bank manager had to be called over. Papers were signed. Reed's hand trembled slightly as he wrote the final signature. The mortgage document was stamped "Paid in Full" in bright red letters. That night, after the church's evening prayer meeting ended, Reed slipped through the shadows to the pastor's office. He pushed an envelope under the door, containing the paid mortgage papers and a simple note written in his rough handwriting. Paid in full. A sinner forgiven. He lingered for a moment, hand pressed against the wooden door, then disappeared into the darkness. The news spread through the congregation like wildfire. Pastor Donnelly announced it during Sunday service, his voice thick with emotion. Brothers and sisters, a miracle has occurred. Our mortgage has been paid in full by an anonymous donor. Lorraine sat in her usual pew, third row from the front, her hands clutching her worn Bible. She knew immediately who had done this. The confirmation came when Pastor Donnelly read the note aloud. She recognized the handwriting from the inventory sheets at the soup kitchen. That evening, she knelt beside her bed, the way she had every night since Henry's death. But tonight's prayers were different. Lord, she whispered, I don't understand. The man who took Henry from me, he's changing. I see it. But this pain in my heart won't let go. Show me what mercy truly means. Show me your will in this. She stayed there for hours, tears falling silently onto her clasped hands. The moon crossed the sky, casting shifting shadows through her bedroom window. Finally, as dawn began to paint the eastern horizon, she felt a peace she hadn't known in weeks. 3 days later, she found herself driving up the long, winding driveway to Reed's mansion. The grounds showed signs of neglect, untrimmed hedges, leaves scattered across the lawn. She parked her old Honda next to his collection of luxury cars, the contrast stark and telling. Reed opened the door before she could knock. He looked thinner, older, his usual confident stance replaced by something more hesitant. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Come in, he finally said, stepping aside. The house felt different too. Gone was the pristine showroom feel. Dust had gathered on the marble countertops. Dishes sat unwashed in the sink. It looked like a home now, albeit a neglected one. Reed moved to the kitchen, his movements uncertain. "Coffee?" "Please." He fumbled with the expensive coffee maker, hands shaking slightly as he measured the grounds. Lorraine watched him struggle, fighting the instinct to help. Finally, the machine gurgled to life. They sat at the kitchen island, steam rising from their mugs. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. "The church mortgage," Lorraine finally said. Reed stared into his coffee. "I sold my first truck, the one that started everything." "Why?" He looked up then, meeting her eyes. "Because some things matter more than others. That truck represented who I was. But who I was, that's not who I want to be anymore." Lorraine took a slow sip of coffee, letting his words settle. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said carefully. "What happened to Henry? That's still raw. It may always be." Reed nodded, accepting this truth. "But," she continued, "I see the man you're trying to be, and that man, he reminds me of what Henry always said about grace, that it's not earned, it's given." Something flickered in Reed's eyes, hope, perhaps, or relief. He didn't speak, afraid to break the fragile moment. Lorraine gestured at the kitchen. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" I don't remember." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Well, your kitchen's a mess, but I bet we can find something to work with." She stood, moving to examine the contents of his refrigerator. Reed watched in amazement as she began pulling out ingredients, her movements efficient and purposeful. Soon, the kitchen filled with the smell of sautéing onions and peppers. "Hand me that spatula," she said, and he complied, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. As they worked together, preparing a simple meal of scrambled eggs and toast, something shifted in the air between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. A truce, delicate as morning frost, but just as real. They ate at the kitchen island, the silence now comfortable rather than strained. Occasionally, one of them would make a small observation about the food or the weather, and the other would respond. Once, Reed even made a mild joke about his cooking skills, and Lorraine's laugh, though brief, was genuine. When the meal was finished, they washed the dishes together, falling into an easy rhythm of washing and drying. The simple domesticity of the task seemed to heal something in both of them. As Lorraine prepared to leave, Reed walked her to her car. The late afternoon sun painted everything in soft gold, making the neglected gardens look almost magical. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded, understanding he meant more than just the meal. "I'll see you at the soup kitchen?" "Yes," he replied. "I'll be there." As she drove away, Reed stood watching until her car disappeared down the winding driveway. Inside his pocket, his fingers touched the silver cross he still carried, not as a burden now, but as a reminder of the path he had chosen. In her car, Lorraine hummed softly, not quite a hymn, not quite a lullaby, but something in between. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel quite so dark. The morning edition of the Pinewood Gazette landed on doorsteps with a thud that echoed through the small town. Above the fold, bold letters proclaimed, "Local business tightens dark past, the truth behind Henry Field's death." The article, complete with grainy photographs from Reed's Hells Angels days and police reports, spread through Pinewood like wildfire. At the Super Save market, Lorraine reached for a carton of eggs, pretending not to notice Mrs. Henderson and her friend quickly changing aisles. Their whispers carried anyway. "Can you believe she's working for him? After what he did to her, Henry? I heard they're more than just employer and employee, if you know what I mean." The eggs trembled in Lorraine's hand. She set them down carefully, straightened her back, and walked to the checkout counter with as much dignity as she could muster. The teenage cashier avoided her eyes. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Someone had shared the article on Facebook, tagging her name. The comments beneath were cruel daggers. How could she forgive that monster? Birds of a feather. Sleeping with the devil who killed her husband. She turned off her phone. At home, she found an envelope in her mailbox. No return address, just a single sheet of paper inside with cut-out magazine letters. Jezebel. Her hands shook as she crumpled it up. Reed wasn't faring much better. His office received dozens of cancellation notices from clients. The phone rang constantly with reporters seeking comment. His secretary quit, leaving a Bible on her desk with Exodus 20, verse 13 highlighted. Thou shalt not kill. He called Lorraine that evening. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice rough. I never meant for this to touch you. I know, she replied softly, but God never promised us an easy path. The next few days brought more whispers, more sideways glances. Even at church, where forgiveness should have reigned, judgment flourished instead. During Wednesday night Bible study, Sister Margaret made pointed comments about wolves in sheep's clothing. Brother Taylor suggested reviewing the church's volunteer screening process. Pastor Donnelly tried to calm the waters, reminding his congregation about grace and redemption, but the damage was done. People moved away from Lorraine in the pews. The soup kitchen volunteers stopped chatting with her during prep time. Reed watched it all from a distance, his heart breaking. He considered leaving town, thinking it might make things easier for her. But when he suggested it during one of their quiet coffee meetings, Lorraine shook her head. Running away won't heal anything, she said. Sometimes we have to stand in the storm to see the rainbow. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy humidity that promised rain. Lorraine dressed carefully in her best floral dress, the one Henry had given her for their last anniversary. She arrived early to help set up for the service, ignoring the way some deacons suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. The church filled slowly. Reed slipped in last, taking his usual spot in the back pew. He'd started attending regularly, though he never participated in the social hour afterward. His presence today caused a ripple of murmurs through the congregation. When it came time for the morning announcements, Lorraine rose to speak about the soup kitchen's needs. She gripped the pulpit, trying to focus on her notes as whispers rustled through the sanctuary like dead leaves. We're especially in need of volunteers for... The words began to swim on the page. The whispers grew louder, or maybe that was just the rushing in her ears. The church seemed to tilt sideways. For the evening shift. Her voice faltered. The lights overhead grew impossibly bright, then dimmed at the edges. She felt herself swaying. From the back of the church, Reed saw it happening. He was moving before he even realized it, pushing past people frozen in their pews. He reached the front just as Lorraine's knees buckled, catching her before she could hit the hardwood floor. Someone call 911, his voice boomed, through the sanctuary, shocking people into action. He cradled her head gently, noting how pale she looked, how shallow her breathing seemed. Pastor Donnelly appeared with a glass of water, but Lorraine remained unresponsive. Reed held her hand, counting the weak beats of her pulse until sirens wailed in the distance. The paramedics worked efficiently, loading her onto a stretcher. When they asked if anyone would ride with her, the congregation stood silent. Reed stepped forward. I will. In the ambulance, under harsh fluorescent lights, he held her small hand between both of his. The paramedic attached monitors, started an IV, asked questions Reed couldn't fully answer. Has she been under unusual stress lately? Any history of fainting spells? When did she last eat? Reed's guilt grew with each question. He knew the stress she'd been under, all because of him, because of his past, because of choices made decades ago that were still causing pain. "Please," he whispered, not caring if the paramedic heard. "Please, God, don't take her. Don't punish her for my sins. Take me instead. I deserve it. But not her, please, not her." The monitor beeped steadily. Outside, rain began to fall, streaking the ambulance windows. Lorraine's hand remained limp in his as they raced through the wet streets toward County General. In the emergency room's harsh lighting, Reed paced while doctors examined her. The clean hospital corridors smelled of disinfectant and fear. Each time someone in scrubs walked past, he straightened, hoping for news. "Please," he whispered again and again, a prayer and a plea. "Don't punish her for my sins." Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly pallor. In a plastic chair meant for someone half his size, Reed kept his vigil, still holding Lorraine's hand, still praying to a God he hoped would listen to a sinner like him. The steady beeping of hospital monitors filled the room as Lorraine's eyelids fluttered open 3 days after her collapse. Harsh fluorescent lights made her squint as consciousness slowly returned. She tried to move her hand but found it weighed down. Reed had fallen asleep in the visitor's chair, his large, calloused hand still holding hers. His clothes were wrinkled, his face unshaven. Empty coffee cups littered the windowsill behind him. A nurse entering the room smiled kindly at Lorraine. "He hasn't left since they brought you in," she whispered, checking the monitors. "Not even to shower. Had to bring him sandwiches myself or he wouldn't eat." Lorraine's slight movement woke Reed. His eyes snapped open, relief flooding his tired face. "Thank God," he whispered hoarsely. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by one of your trucks," Lorraine managed with a weak smile. Her throat felt dry and scratchy. Reed quickly helped her sip water through a straw. His hands trembled slightly. "You scared me half to death," he said quietly. "Don't do that again." The door opened as Dr. Matthews entered, clipboard in hand. His expression was serious as he reviewed her charts. "Mrs. Fields, we've run extensive tests while you were unconscious. I'm afraid I have some concerning news about your heart condition." Lorraine listened as the doctor explained about her weakened heart muscles, the need for lifetime medication, regular monitoring. Her mind spun with terms like chronic condition and careful management. Through it all, Reed sat silently, his jaw clenching tighter with each new detail. "The treatment plan will be extensive," Dr. Matthews concluded, "but with proper care and medication, you can still live a full life. Do you have any questions about the costs or coverage?" Before Lorraine could respond, Reed stood up. "She doesn't need to worry about that," he said firmly. "Everything will be taken care of." Later that afternoon, while Lorraine napped, Reed met privately with the hospital's financial office. He signed over his remaining business holdings, 3 trucks and a warehouse, to cover her complete treatment. "This needs to remain anonymous," he insisted. "She can't know it was me." News of Lorraine's condition spread through Pinewood like wildfire. Some church members sent cards and flowers. Others continued their whispered judgments. Surely this was God's punishment for associating with someone like Reed Callahan. But a few people began to notice things, like how Reed spent every day at the hospital, learning from nurses how to help Lorraine walk the halls safely, how he took notes during her medication instructions, how he prayed beside her bed when he thought no one was watching. Martha Wilson, who ran the town's grocery store, was one of the first to shift her perspective. She'd been among the harshest critics until she delivered flowers to Lorraine's room and saw Reed gently helping her eat soup, telling silly stories to make her smile. "Maybe we've been too quick to judge," Martha told her friend Susan over coffee. "That man's been there day and night. Real evil doesn't show that kind of devotion." When Lorraine was finally released from the hospital 2 weeks later, she found her small house had been cleaned top to bottom. Fresh groceries filled her fridge. Her garden had been weeded and tended. "The church ladies?" she asked Reed as he helped her inside. He shook his head. "Just me. Needed something to do while you were sleeping all those hours." Lorraine's recovery was slow but steady. Reed visited daily, bringing meals and checking her medication schedule. Between visits, he began looking for new direction in his life. His empire was gone, but for the first time, that fact didn't bother him. He joined a volunteer group called Helping Hands that repaired homes for elderly residents. His mechanical skills proved invaluable. Soon he was coordinating projects, teaching younger volunteers about wiring and plumbing. One morning, while replacing Mrs. Johnson's leaky roof, Reed overheard her talking to a neighbor. "Can you believe that's the same man everyone was gossiping about? He's been here since sunrise, won't even take money for materials." Lorraine watched these changes from afar, her heart growing stronger as she witnessed Reed's transformation. One evening, she sat at her small writing desk and penned a letter. "Dear Reed, many speak of repentance, but few live it. You've chosen the harder path, showing change through actions rather than words. Each roof you fix, each elderly neighbor you help, builds something greater than any business empire. Thank you for teaching me that grace isn't just received, it's revealed in how we rebuild from our ruins." She sealed the envelope and said a quiet prayer before sending it. Outside her window, spring flowers were beginning to bloom, bringing new color to her small garden. Like those flowers pushing through soil toward sunlight, something new was growing in Pinewood: understanding, compassion, and the slow miracle of transformation. Reed found the letter in his mailbox that evening. He read it 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in his wallet, next to where he once kept business cards marking his success. This paper meant more than all those ever had. That night, he worked late helping Mr. Peterson repair his front porch steps. His hands were sore, his back ached, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Across town, Lorraine took her evening medication and smiled, knowing that sometimes the greatest acts of grace happen not in grand gestures, but in the quiet choosing of a better path, one day at a time. Spring painted Pinewood in soft pastels. Dogwood trees dotted the churchyard with white blooms, and purple wisteria draped the old wooden fence like nature's own decoration. The morning air held that special Georgia sweetness that came with the season's change. Reed Callahan sat in his truck outside First Baptist, gripping the steering wheel. He'd been coming to services regularly since Lorraine's hospital stay, but always slipped into the back pew just as things started. Today felt different. His hands trembled slightly as he straightened his tie, the first one he'd worn in years. Inside, sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden floors. Lorraine Fields sat in her usual spot in the front pew, still looking fragile but with more color in her cheeks than weeks before. Her medical treatments were working, though recovery remained a slow journey. As the congregation settled, Pastor Donnelly's calm voice filled the sanctuary. "Today, one of our brothers has asked to speak." He paused, looking toward the back of the church. "Reed Callahan, would you come forward?" A hush fell over the room. Reed stood slowly, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. Some people whispered behind their hands, others stared straight ahead. He could feel every eye on him as he made his way to the front. Standing before the congregation, Reed looked nothing like the wealthy businessman who'd once dominated Pinewood's business scene. His suit was simple, his demeanor humble. His hands shook as he gripped the podium. "Many of you know me," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Or you think you do. You knew Razor Callahan, the biker who built an empire, the man who threw money around like it could buy respect. He swallowed hard. But that man was hiding something. The silence in the church grew deeper. Lorraine sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Years ago, on a rainy night, I was responsible for an accident that took the life of Henry Fields. Reed's voice cracked. I didn't flee the scene like some said. I stayed until help came, but I never came forward. I let my old gang take the blame, hid behind lawyers and money, tried to bury my guilt in success. Tears began rolling down his cheeks, but he pressed on. Then God put me in this church's kitchen, serving beside the very woman I'd wronged. Lorraine Fields showed me kindness when she had every right to hate me. She touched a sinner and made him human again. Several people were crying now. Pastor Donnelly stood nearby, his presence supportive and steady. I can't bring Henry back. I can't undo what I did. But I can stand here and tell the truth. I can ask for forgiveness, from God, from this community, and most of all, from Lorraine. For a moment, the only sound was quiet sobbing from various corners of the sanctuary. Then, slowly, someone stood up. It was Martha Wilson from the grocery store. Others followed. The hardware store owner, several church elders, young families Reed had helped through his volunteer work. Finally, Lorraine rose. Though still weak, she stood straight and tall. Her voice was soft but clear in the hushed church. I forgive you, Reed Callahan. 4 simple words, but they carried the weight of mountains. Reed's legs nearly gave out as someone began to sing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The hymn spread through the congregation like a wave. Voices joined together, some strong, some trembling with emotion. Mrs. Johnson, whose roof Reed had fixed, reached out to squeeze his hand as she sang. The pastor's wife wiped tears from her eyes while harmonizing. That saved a wretch like me. The music swelled, filling every corner of the sanctuary with its message of redemption. Sunlight seemed to glow brighter through the windows, as if heaven itself was witnessing this moment of grace. I once was lost, but now am found. Through tear-blurred eyes, Reed saw Lorraine make her way toward him. She took his hand, joining her voice to the hymn. Together they stood, former enemies transformed by forgiveness, their voices blending with the congregation's as ancient words of hope and redemption filled the air. Was blind, but now I see. The summer heat gave way to autumn's crisp mornings, and with the changing seasons came transformation in pine wood. The old McKinley warehouse on Pine Street, once a symbol of the town's economic decline, now buzzed with new life and purpose. Fresh paint brightened its brick walls, and hand-painted Bible verses about grace and renewal wrapped around the building like embracing arms. Above the entrance, a wooden sign read, Henry Fields Community Kitchen, in warm golden letters. Inside, the aroma of fresh-baked bread and simmering soup filled the air. Lorraine Fields moved through the busy kitchen with quiet authority, her gentle voice guiding volunteers as they prepared meals for the day's service. Miss Jenny, those biscuits smell like heaven itself, she called out to a young widow learning to bake. And Mr. Thompson, your vegetable soup is coming along beautifully. Reed Callahan worked alongside them, his sleeves rolled up to reveal arms covered in faded tattoos. What once marked him as an outlaw now told a different story. Each inked symbol, a chapter in his journey from darkness to light. He'd used the last of his fortune to establish this place, converting his remaining assets into something Henry would have been proud of. We need more onions for tomorrow's stew, Lorraine mentioned as she passed by. I'll handle it, Reed replied, already reaching for his keys. These days, instead of managing a fleet of trucks, he drove a modest pickup loaded with donated groceries and supplies. The kitchen served more than just meals. Veterans gathered at the round tables, finding companionship and understanding. Children from struggling families did homework after school, their notebooks spread out beside plates of warm food. Widows who once spent days alone now found purpose teaching cooking classes or organizing donation drives. The town that had once whispered cruel gossip now showed up with carloads of canned goods and fresh produce from local farms. The mayor himself stopped by weekly, not for photo opportunities, but to roll up his sleeves and wash dishes. On the walls, carefully chosen verses spoke of hope and new beginnings. "Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow," read one above the serving line. Another by the coffee station proclaimed, "Beauty for ashes, joy for mourning." Through it all, Reed and Lorraine worked side by side, their past pain transformed into purpose. She knew which veterans needed extra attention, which children were too proud to ask for seconds, which widows needed someone to listen. He knew how to fix the temperamental ovens, how to stretch resources when donations ran low, how to make newcomers feel welcome despite their rough edges. The kitchen became Pinewood's heart, a place where second chances weren't just promised but lived out daily, where the aroma of home-cooked meals mixed with the sweeter fragrance of grace, where an ex-biker and a widow showed their town what it meant to rebuild from ashes. The autumn sun painted Pinewood in shades of gold and amber as it rose over the Henry Fields. Community kitchen. Crisp morning air carried the first hints of winter, but inside, warmth radiated from every corner. Pies lined the counters, and the ovens hummed with activity as volunteers prepared for the biggest Thanksgiving feast the kitchen had ever hosted. Lorraine adjusted her apron, her strength restored after months of treatment. The medication helped, but she knew her healing came from something deeper, the joy of purpose and the peace of forgiveness. She watched as Reed directed a group of teenagers unloading boxes of canned goods, his patient guidance a far cry from the angry man who'd first walked into the church kitchen. Through the windows, children chased each other across the front yard, their laughter mixing with the sound of fallen leaves crunching beneath their feet. Parents chatted on benches while keeping watchful eyes on the little ones. The scene brought a smile to Lorraine's face. This place had become more than just a kitchen. It was a sanctuary of second chances. The church bells began to ring, their melody floating across town, calling people to gather. The sound reminded Lorraine of Sunday mornings with Henry, but now the memory brought comfort instead of pain. She'd learned that love didn't have to die with loss. It could transform and grow in new ways. Sunlight streamed through the eastern windows, catching Reed's face as he turned from his task. The golden light softened his weathered features, highlighting threads of silver in his hair. He looked up, meeting her gaze with a smile that reached his eyes, something that had once been so rare, but now came naturally. They found themselves drawn to the quiet corner by the window, where two chairs waited as if meant for them. Reed's calloused hand found hers, rough fingers gentling as they intertwined with her own. Outside, the church choir began their morning practice, their harmonies drifting through the air like a blessing. "Listen," Lorraine whispered, squeezing his hand. "The choir's singing Amazing Grace." The hymn filled the morning air, its familiar verses speaking of redemption and hope. Reed's eyes grew misty as he listened. The man who once commanded an empire of chrome and steel now found his greatest joy in serving others alongside her. In giving everything away, he'd found something priceless. "God gave you back what you gave up," Lorraine said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not your empire, but your soul." Reed nodded, understanding flooding his features. "And you gave me peace," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. the kitchen filled with more volunteers arriving for the feast preparations. The scent of fresh bread wafted from the ovens, mixing with the aroma of roasting turkeys and simmering gravy. Laughter echoed through the halls, the beautiful sound of the forgiven finding joy in community. Children darted in and out, stealing cookies when they thought no one was looking. Veterans shared stories over coffee, their medals glinting in the morning light. Young mothers cradled babies, while grandmothers taught them old family recipes. Every face told a story of healing, of grace received and grace given. In this moment, surrounded by the warmth of fellowship and forgiveness, the truth was clear. Even the most broken pieces could be made whole again through grace. The Henry Fields Community Kitchen stood as living proof that love could rebuild what guilt and grief had torn down. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.